Okay, the next objection is a really famous objection from David Hume. Now this is going to go a little bit deeper philosophically, but it's important to be aware of David Hume because once you start having these conversations with people online or in person at a university in particular, David Hume's argument against believing in miracles is going to be one of the first things that come up. And so it's good to be familiar with his argument and familiar with how to respond to it. So I'm going to take some time this morning and cover Hume's argument against believing in miracles. So David Hume, if you're not familiar with him, he was a famous Scottish Enlightenment thinker during the 1700s. He's very well known as being he's probably the most famous skeptic in history. So he brings to his approach, or he brings to his thinking, his philosophy, a lot of skepticism, which actually has been helpful in the history of philosophy because one of the things he was skeptical about was the scientific method. And so one of the things that we can be thankful for when it comes to Hume is that he showed, even in the 1700s, the weaknesses of the scientific method. And he brought his skepticism to science. Now he loves science, I think as we all should, but he rightly, in my mind, pointed out that science, the scientific method, is not going to achieve for us absolute certainty. And so we can be thankful for his skeptical thinking, showing how even the scientific method is not going to give us absolute knowledge. It's great, it's helpful. Science is very good in helping us know and understand things, but it's never going to get us absolute certainty. And Hume, thankfully, pointed that out well. So he's very well known in the history of philosophy as a skeptic, most likely an atheist. It was kind of risky to be an atheist in the 1700s. And so there's some debate among historians as to whether or not he really was an atheist. Some people would say, yeah, he was just kind of hiding it because there could be a lot of danger in coming out too strongly as an atheist in the 1700s. But if not an atheist, then definitely leaning that direction. Most likely, I would say he probably was an atheist. So not only did he bring his skepticism to the scientific method, he probably even more famously, brought his skepticism to any sort of religious belief as well. Now, what's interesting about Hume's argument against miracles is that he's not arguing against the possibility of miracles. That's what makes his argument a bit different. That's what makes his case a little bit different than what we've looked at before. He's not arguing against the possibility of miracles. He's making the case that a wise person should never believe that an actual miracle has happened. So he's making the case against believing in miracles. And here's kind of in a simpler form his argument. Okay, so this is not directly from him. This is more of a simplification of his argument. Okay, as myself and others have tried to summarize what he's getting at, so I don't have to read for you 20 pages, right? So here's how his argument flows. His first point is that natural law is, by definition, a description of a regular occurrence. Now you have to remember what's going on in the 1700s, okay? So this is part of the Enlightenment. This is after Isaac Newton now. And so after the scientific revolution. So people are thinking at this time that natural laws, the laws of nature, are these fixed, immovable things. Now we've learned a lot since Newton, right? And so we don't see the laws of nature as rigid scientifically as they did in the 1700s. But think about like Isaac Newton's laws of motion, the law of gravity, those sort of natural laws of nature. The thinking at the time was that these things were so well evidenced. You know, every scientific experiment that we perform proves these things over and over and over again. And so these are immovable, unalterable laws. There was just this very strong belief in these natural laws that could not be violated. So it's important to put him in his historical context. Step 2, a miracle, by definition, is a rare occurrence. I think we could agree with that. We talked about how rare they are, even in biblical times. Premise 3, the evidence for the regular is always greater than that for the rare. His fourth point, a wise person always bases his belief on the greater evidence. That seems right. Right? Therefore, a wise person should never believe in miracles. So this might be the first time you've been exposed to Hume's argument. So I want to give you a few minutes to digest it, maybe talk about it out loud. What's your initial reaction to it? Do you see any flaws? If you were going to push back, if you were going to be a skeptic to the skeptic and push back against Hume, what premise might you go after? What premise might you attack? That's always what's a first helpful step when you're going to oppose somebody, is you lay out their argument and think, okay, now where are they making their mistake? What premise have they made a mistake in? And then focus in on that part where you think they made a mistake. So maybe talk through that. Where do you think he's making a mistake here? Because some of these premises seem appropriate, right? So I'll let you guys discuss it out loud for a few minutes here. Okay. I think one of the first red flags that we should have, remember that he's not arguing that miracles are impossible. He's arguing that we never should believe any miracle claim. So already there should be red flags going up, because he's saying that miracles are possible. He's not denying that. He's just saying that we should never believe that a miracle has happened. And so you're forced, his approach then, or his argument then, forces you into a very odd predicament where you should never believe something that might in fact happen. Does that make sense? And so right there, I think red flags should be going off, that we should never believe something that could in fact happen. He's not arguing that miracles are impossible, just that we should never believe in them. And so that seems right there to be a mistake, that we should never believe in something that could possibly happen. So if I would focus in then on his argument, those are just red flags that go off immediately, but where's the problem in his argument? I would hone in on premise 3. I would say, and I'm not the only one, but a lot of us who have critiqued this argument say that the problem, the mistake he makes, comes in his third premise. That he's not measuring evidence correctly. When he talks about the greatness of evidence, he's not measuring evidence correctly. He's making this mistake, some people word it like this. He's making the mistake of adding up evidence instead of weighing evidence. Okay? Let's go back to one of my favorite examples. I've used this before, but let's go back to that fun example of a friend claiming that they hit a hole in one, right? And let's say that this was a long par 4, so it's not something that happens hardly ever, right? Now, if I've got a friend who comes up to me and says that they hit a hole in one on a long par 4 like this, I could, if I was adding up the evidence, I could add up all the people who never got a hole in one on that course or that particular hole, right? And that would be millions and millions and millions of people who did not get a hole in one. I'd be adding up that as the evidence. That would be the regular occurrence. The regular occurrence in that scenario is not getting a hole in one. And then I would compare that, if I'm following Hume's approach, I would compare that to the one person who's claiming to, in fact, have gotten a hole in one. And so if you're using Hume's approach here, you're adding up the evidence and you're like, man, I've got millions and millions of people who did not get a hole-in-one. That seems like a whole lot of evidence for not getting a hole-in-one. And I've only got one person who claims to have done it. And so if you're taking Hume's approach and you're weighing the evidence, you're like, man, the evidence is just, going this way I guess, the evidence is just so much more in this favor because there's so many people who didn't get a hole-in-one. And you might be seeing, maybe more clearer now, where Hume is making a mistake. He's adding the evidence instead of weighing the evidence. Because he would say then, the evidence for the regular, the million people who didn't get a hole-in-one, the evidence for the regular occurrence is greater than that for the rare, the one person who claims to have gotten a hole-in-one. Because more people certainly didn't get a hole-in-one. So you shouldn't believe your friend when he claims to have gotten a hole-in-one. Well, that's just not a good way to measure evidence. That's adding up the evidence instead of weighing the evidence. What would be better to do, right, instead of just adding up all the people who didn't get a hole-in-one, is to evaluate the evidence for the person who claims to have gotten a hole-in-one, right? And when I say weigh the evidence, evaluate the evidence, look to see maybe if there were any cameras that were running at the time. Were there any eyewitness accounts of this hole-in-one? So that would be a better way to measure or weigh the evidence instead of just adding it up. See what he's doing, and this helped me a lot bringing my background in actuarial science to this, because a lot of actuarial work has to do with probability and statistics. And so I could see right away what Hume was doing incorrectly by adding up evidence like this, is that he was calculating probabilities, forward-looking, right? He was saying, would you bet on, for example, would you bet on somebody getting a hole-in-one on that hole? Well, no, I wouldn't bet on it, because the odds are so unlikely that they would get a hole-in-one. It's so rare, I would never bet on it. He's calculating future probabilities. And I think it's a mistake to apply that sort of future probability calculation to the past. That might help you in terms of being how skeptical you would be about a claim, but that it can't nail down for you a certainty. And of all people, you think Hume would have seen that, being the classic famous skeptic that he was. We shouldn't base our belief about some event on the past based on how rare or unlikely it is to happen, but on the quality of evidence for that particular event. Now, this is a common mistake, okay? We do this in our thinking. So in that sense, I don't want to be too hard on Hume, because we ourselves often make this. In fact, I'll share a story with you if we've got time, where I made this mistake in my own life. Think about, maybe this has happened to you. If you've had a friend, let's say, who won an incredible prize, won the lottery. If you've ever had somebody in your family or a friend of yours or an acquaintance, a coworker, who claimed to have won the lottery, it's very difficult to believe them at first, right? Because the probabilities are so small. It's just such an unlikely occurrence. You might think, well, no, you didn't. You're just pulling my leg, right? There's no way you won $1 million or $10 million in a lottery. That's just so unlikely. And so we reject it, we dismiss it, we don't believe it because it's unlikely. But that's a mistake. We shouldn't do that, right? We shouldn't reject something just because it's unlikely. We're not calculating future probabilities. We're looking at a possible event in the past. And so what's appropriate to do in that situation is to say, well, do you have any evidence for winning the lottery? It's not impossible that happened, but I'd like to see some evidence for it. So I'll share the story from my own life about when I made this mistake in thinking. I had a friend, I was in high school at the time, so we're talking 30 plus years ago. And back in the 90s, We were obsessed with video games at the time as well, not unlike teenagers today. And we all used to subscribe to this magazine called Nintendo Power. So those of you in the older generations like myself might remember this magazine. It came once a month, Nintendo Power, and it talked about, we didn't have the internet to go on the internet and find out about the new games that were coming out. We had to get a magazine in the mail to find out about the new video games that they were working on and coming out with. So Nintendo Power would come out once a month, and they would always run these giveaway promotions. And one time, the magazine Nintendo Power was going to give away the car from the movie RoboCop, another classic 80s, right? RoboCop, the movie. This is a Ford Taurus that they redesigned for the movie, and they were going to give one of those Ford Tauruses that was in the actual movie away to somebody. And my friend came to me, I remember so vividly, right? We were all teenagers, but he came to me in school and he told me that he had won the car. He got this RoboCop car. And I didn't believe him. I said, there's no way that happened. But what was I doing? I was making the same mistake that Hume made. Because the event is so unlikely, the probabilities are so small that he actually won the car, I just wouldn't believe him. But I was making that same mistake. I was adding up the evidence. I was thinking about all the people who didn't win and the one person who claims to have won, and I was adding up those and saying, well, there's just so many more people who didn't win, that's more likely, and so I'm not going to believe your claim because it's just so rare. I was making that mistake of adding up the evidence instead of weighing the evidence. What should I have done? What should I have done? And said, okay, well, I'm open to that possibility, but I need to see some evidence for it. And that would have been the better approach. And eventually I did see the evidence, and it was his car in the driveway. And so he proved to me that he won the car. And it was fun. I rode in it several times. He ended up, if he would have been smart, he would have kept it in good shape, and probably would be worth a lot of money nowadays, but he, like a normal teenager, just drove it to death and ended up crashing it, if you can believe it. Yeah, it's kind of a bummer. But he's a Christian. Neither one of us were Christians at the time, but he's a Christian nowadays. And so it'd be kind of fun to reconnect with him and chat with him about it after all these years. I haven't talked to him for decades. All right, so being skeptical is appropriate. It's appropriate to be skeptical about unlikely events, but to reject that a rare event took place without even evaluating the evidence, I think is inappropriate. That's the very definition of being closed-minded, right? We're just not going to believe something, period, no matter what the evidence is. So I think Hume just made a mistake there in his thinking, adding up the evidence instead of weighing it. Good to be skeptical, not good to be closed-minded.